Welcome to Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. I'm Michelle McCormick. Well, now that Halloween is behind us, the focus is now on the holidays. Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, and Kwanzaa, all around the corner. And well, the decorations are already up in some stores, but the holidays aren't always easy for some folks. Today, we're going to talk with a specialist about how to get through the grief. We're also going to touch a little bit on National Family Caregivers Month, that's November, and why it's important to recognize the people who give support to their loved ones. But first, Millennium Physician Group is a leading comprehensive independent physician group in Florida with more than 560 healthcare providers at 150 locations in 19 Florida counties. We serve almost 500,000 patients. Millennium Physician Group is your connection to a healthier life. Learn more at millenniumphysician.com. Connection, innovation, Inspiration Health. Welcome to Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. Each week, we talk about the healthcare issues that are important to you, inviting providers and experts to inspire you to take control of your healthcare decisions. Join us right now for a healthcare journey as we work together to achieve the best health outcome for you. Well, according to grief.com, the November and December holidays are usually the most challenging for people who have lost loved ones. And no doubt, memories of gatherings and special times together are really, really tough. Our guest today is Rachel Weinstein. Rachel is a grief specialist, educator, and founder of the Jacksonville Center for Grief and Loss. And Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today because I think it is so valuable as we move into these difficult times for people. We're going to touch on that. But first, give us a little background about you and what led you down your path.
Sure. Okay, so I started to work in the area of mental health back in, 1991 when I graduated with my master's in counseling psychology. I was a general therapist for years and in another state in Pennsylvania. And then I incurred a loss of my own, and just as a result of trying to find support for myself, I recognized how ill-prepared a lot of very well-intentioned, well-trained helping professionals were. My physician, a therapist, psychiatrist, they all did what they do so well in their particular lanes, but nobody really knew how to approach and support my grief. So I became really interested in I just told myself that if I ever got through it, I would try to be part of the solution and would dedicate the rest of my career to supporting grief and loss. And long story short, I did find my way to some grief experts who were able to support me beautifully, and I then got additional training and education in the area of grief support and have been doing strictly grief support and education ever since. So for almost 25 years now, I've devoted my professional mental health focused career to grief support and education. I founded the Jacksonville Center for Grief in 2017 after having moved to the area in 2014. And I offer not only individual support and education for grief and loss, but also for families, for couples. One of the things I offer that's really unique, I think, is that I will make a house call. I will often, it's dependent upon the circumstance, but as you can imagine, in the area of grief, sometimes people aren't in a place either physically or emotionally to get up and out and come to me. So in addition to what the pandemic provided us with, which is the Zoom ability, which of course I do that too, but I will also go to where someone is if they need me.
Well, let's talk about grief. Grief is a big word.
It is.
And, people grieve over the loss of a job or the loss of a pet or the loss of a person, of course.
Exactly.
How do you define grief?
Great question. Grief is actually a normal, natural response to any loss or change. So bereavement is strictly around death and dying, but grief is much more, it's all-encompassing with respect to any loss or change. If it has mattered to you, if the person has died or the relationship has been lost or an animal, if you've moved, if you've lost your job, if you've lost some mobility as you get older, or you're having limitations after a stroke that you survived, but you now have some limitations to a vision or mobility, that is grief. That you'll find yourself in grief.
Absolutely. I agree. I mean, it's limitless, honestly.
It really is.
So what about those? I mean, there's so many factors. What makes grief so difficult? How does our mind process the grief?
Right.
So many different ways.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that makes grief so difficult is that nobody's talking about it. And, the reason we have a fire drill is because if there's a fire, you want to have it be instinct. You want to know what to do without having to think about it. And that's why we practice fire drills. And when you think about grief, every single one of us either is going through it or will go through it. There's no exception, literally none. Yet we just don't talk about it. So we find ourselves at a loss for what to say to someone else when they're grieving or what to do ourselves when we're in grief. And that's one of the reasons that it's so difficult is the preparation.
Yeah, I have the hardest time when a coworker's husband died or a coworker's wife died, and they pass around a card, a sympathy card.
Yeah.
I never know what to write.
Right.
I never know how to approach that person afterwards. It's a little uncomfortable.
Sure.
How do you counsel people to have a good response to someone else's grief?
Another great question. One of the most important things I think that you can do is really not the only thing, but one thing you should never do is nothing. So don't back away from the person. Don't refuse to ask them genuinely, how are you? If you are in a place to hear how they really are, don't say it in passing and expect I'm fine or I'm getting by to be enough.
Right.
So what I would encourage anyone to do is to say something true, which can always be, I'm so sorry to have learned of your loss. If you know the person who's died, or if you knew the person who's died, and you're trying to support the loved one left behind, share a memory with them. If you're writing a card saying something like, John brought so many smiles to my young child when they sat together and blew bubbles with a little bubble maker, something that their loved one who's left behind can look back on and say, oh, it touches me that my loved one touched someone else, and they can reflect upon that. If you didn't know their loved one, simply saying something like, I'm sorry. A lot of people say, I'm sorry for your loss. And while there's nothing technically wrong with that, it's so overused now that it's become cliche. So I encourage people just to say, I'm so sorry to learn of your loss, or I'm just so sorry. I have no words, but you're not alone. I'm here for you.
I think very valuable words. Just the I'm sorry. Period.
Exactly. One thing that a lot of people do that I've noticed is they'll say, let me know if you need anything. Well, the person who's grieving is not going to pick up the phone and call you and say, I need such and such, because first of all, they don't have the energy. And secondly, what they really need is their loved one or their old life back. So don't put the onus upon the person who's grieving to reach out. You reach out to them and either do something, be active about it, bring them some coffee, give them a hug, say, I'd like to come over and help clean your house or open some bills for you or return some, condolence cards or, stuff envelopes, whatever it is. Do an errand, watch your kids while you take a nap.
I think those are the best things you could do for somebody. I think
so
that's
too.
Wonderful advice. Well, I know we're going to talk about grief during the holidays, and we're going to hit that in the next segment. Rachel Weinstein is the grief specialist and educator and founder of Jacksonville Center for Grief and Loss. And we have a lot more that we're going to talk about, because why is grief around the holidays so much more? So we're going to ponder that question here coming up, Rachel. So stick around. The conversation will continue. Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. I'm Michelle McCormick. Each week, we talk about the healthcare issues that are important to you, inviting providers and experts to inspire you and help you take control of your healthcare decisions. Well, Halloween is now behind us, and our focus is going forward into the holiday season. Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, and Kwanzaa all around the corner, and we're definitely seeing the decorations start to go up in a lot of stores. But the holidays aren't always easy for some folks. So today we're talking with a specialist about how to get through the grief of loss surrounding the holidays. Our guest today is Rachel Weinstein. Rachel is a grief specialist, educator, and founder of the Jacksonville Center for Grief and Loss. And Rachel, in the first segment, we talked a lot about what is grief, right? And we hit on some ways to acknowledge it with our people that we know that have had loss. Why is grief around the holidays so difficult?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the word holiday, because a lot of people do think about national holidays. And that's true. Of course, there's Thanksgiving and there's Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa and all of that. But there are also times of personal remembrance. For example, the anniversary date of their death, or maybe it's just been 1 month, but it's the 13th of that month the 13th of the previous month is when your loved one died, and the 13th of every month for a while is difficult. Or the same time of year will kind of trigger grief. As well, you really think about like anniversaries, your birthday, their birthday. Back to school can be really difficult for parents who've lost a child. So that is a holiday in and of it. Those are holidays in and of themselves, right? So we're going to include them. But we also, if you think about just beginning with January, there's New Year's Eve, and February, Valentine's Day, and we've been, I don't know what's in March. I guess St. Patrick's Day could be, right?
Yeah.
But April, a lot of people associate each of these holidays with family gatherings. 4th of July, my dad used to barbecue. And so really you're talking about a year-long holiday assault. I like to think of it as.
True.
It really is a year-long experience in grocery store kind of triggers. In grief work, we call them landmines. When you are triggered by something, either an object, a song. Grocery stores are ripe for challenges in grief because you're going down aisles and you're seeing families and you're looking at them and thinking about, maybe a parent with a child or a couple together. You're triggered by those kinds of memories, but also special foods that your loved one loved, music that's playing overhead. You can't go down an aisle without thinking about, usually, if you've ever been in a grocery store in the aftermath of a loss, somebody who's listening might think about, gosh, when is the last time you were triggered in a grocery store and what happened? It's usually because they saw something that reminded them of their loved one in some way, of their loss in some way. But there you are in public and expected to just keep a public face on. So I just like to say that times of special remembrance should be included in holidays. And what's difficult about grief during the holidays, we're just more acutely aware of what's changed, what we've lost, who we've lost. Even if someone hasn't died, if we've gotten divorced, if our loved one is no longer able to prepare a meal in the same way they were before, or they're in assisted living this year and they can't be with us in the way that they had been before, those kinds of things are very real, and we struggle for a way to stay with the holiday, stay present to the holiday, but also take care of ourselves in our grief.
Well, Rachel, what can we do to get through it? I mean, if every day is going to be some kind of trigger for remembrance, how do we get through that?
Right. The first thing to do is to acknowledge to yourself that you're having a hard time and it's okay. So give yourself just permission to feel off, like you're not your normal self, because it's a particularly tough time for you. The next thing to do is to tell people who care about you that you're going through a tough time as well. So let them know up front. Don't try to fake it. Don't stuff it. Just say, hey, this is a particularly difficult time of year for me. I just kind of want to let you know. Think about then for yourself what you need to do to get through it. It may mean that you have to negotiate a little bit with let's take, for example, you're expected to go to a series of holiday gatherings at Christmas, let's just say. And you normally, hop from this person's house to that person's house, and then this is your routine. But this year, it's just really difficult. So ask yourself, how can I get a piece of what I need and still show up in a way that other people might expect me to do? If there's something you can do to just negotiate a little bit and say, I'm happy to come to that party. I can only stay for, half an hour. If you're feeling okay after half an hour, you can continue to stay. But give yourself some room to make things look a little different this year, to be easier on yourself.
Yeah, Rachel is a grief specialist, educator, and founder of the Jacksonville Center for Grief and Loss. Valuable information, Rachel. And I know it's hard. It's really hard. And the pandemic, didn't help with matters. I mean, there was the whole year, the whole time, not even during the holidays, when we couldn't see our loved ones that were in assisted living facilities. Right. I mean, that changed a lot. Our kids weren't in school. We couldn't see our healthcare providers. How that's grief in itself, I'm sure that and then the holidays, everything was kind of opened up. A year ago, they were saying don't have large gatherings. And now all we're seeing are large gatherings at football games and baseball games and at colleges. How does somebody juggle all that constant change around the grief?
Well, I think that generally speaking, people who are grieving, let's say they're grieving loss and alongside the pandemic, I think people who were in lockdown during their grief were somewhat often, at least a lot of my clients have told me, they were somewhat relieved at not having the expectation of going out into the office. They could stay inside and do their work from home, and didn't have to kind of show up out in the public. So to some degree, there was a little bit of alleviation during the pandemic for people who were in grief. And yet, if particularly alongside COVID-19 and losses that people incurred, either they couldn't visit their loved ones or they were losing loved ones and they couldn't visit, that was a tremendous, and still is, there's tremendous grief resulting from that. There's just a lot of unfinished, we call it in mental health, unfinished business that happens as a result of a loss where you can't even be with the person. You have I don't use the word closure. I don't know what that is or what that feels like, because it's a transformative process. Grief changes us forever. A loss really is a loss for a lifetime. But when you haven't had the opportunity to be with your loved one, to hold their hand, to hug them, to let them see you and you see them, it's a really big deal. So one of the things I do with people when I have them in my space is to help them complete some of that unfinished business as much as possible, even in the absence of their loved one. Then there's just some little things that I do with them to help them pull through some of the missing pieces.
Yeah, the saying time heals all wounds too. I mean, it's relative. What is time?
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because I was just saying to someone the other day, it's not just time that heals old wounds, it's also what you do with the time. So passing time in and of itself doesn't heal anything. It can soften pain in a certain way over time, but it really matters what you're doing with that time. If you're getting support, if you're taking care of your body, your mind, your spirit, that matters most.
Well, and you mentioned triggers earlier, grocery store triggers, music, foods.
Right.
But circling back a little bit to the holiday time,
right.
A favorite ornament, or do you even put up a tree this year if you've lost a loved one in the past year? How do you get through those super commercialized holidays when you're already dealing with grief?
One thing I encourage people to do is to create a space for their loved one alongside that holiday. So, for example, let's just say it's Thanksgiving and you're going to be around loved ones, and one loved one is missing that year. Either they're no longer here on this earth, or they simply can't be with you in the same way that they were before. To create, there are a lot of ways to do it. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is to light a candle and have their photograph and put it in a special place in the room. You can even take the candle and put in a wish, a prayer, a memory, and pass it around and ask everyone to do the same. They can do it silently or they can do it aloud, and keep that candle burning with that person's picture next to it somewhere near where you're having your gathering. It can be something like that. It could be having a book where people come in and sign with a memory of their loved one who's missing. And it could be honoring their loved one with a contribution with their favorite dish, what they always made or what they would have loved, and something simple but meaningful to incorporate the memory of their loved one into their celebration.
I think that is fantastic. So why is getting support so important, and where do you get it? Okay.
Well, the why is this. Grief is stress. Right? It stresses our body, our psyche, our physically. There's an impact to grief. So we get thirstier. A lot of people don't know, but we get thirstier because it's like our body is trying to process all of this grief. It's like we're running a marathon, so we need more water. And we get more tired because when you're not well, your body slows you down so that you can heal, and the body doesn't know the difference between a physical injury or illness and an emotional one, so it will slow us down. Well, if we don't take care of the stress of our grief, the impact of that is really lowered immunity. Stress and cortisol, without any kind of alleviation, will beat down our defenses and leave us ripe for infection and illness. And that's one huge consequence of not taking care of our grief. Mm-hmm. So an antidote to that is stress reduction, and stress reduction through support. You ask where you could get that. Well, of course, I'll throw myself into that mix. Mm-hmm. Anyone can reach me by calling 408-540-4950 or going to my website, Jack's Grief, JAXGRIEF as in Frank.com. As well, there are other resources. There's community hospice. Even I believe that they have a program still where even if you haven't taken part of in their services, you can still benefit from their counseling. Mm-hmm, I think that they still offer those.
I believe so.
There are things like Compassionate Friends. There are all kinds of groups. I know that in Neptune Beach now there's an organization called here tomorrow, and they do free of charge counseling and groups, even through telehealth. So there are a lot of options like that. And if anyone has any questions, my own services aside, I will help to link someone as best I can to a community resource.
That is fantastic. Rachel Weinstein. Coming up next, we're going to continue talking with Rachel. We're going to talk a little bit more about grief, of course, and we're also going to focus a little bit on National Family Caregiver Month. What's that all about? We will continue the conversation. Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. I'm Michelle McCormick. Each week, we talk about the healthcare issues that are important to you, inviting providers and experts to inspire you to take control of your healthcare decisions. It's November, and November is a slew of national holidays, if you will, but it's also National Family Caregivers Month. The purpose of this specific topic is to recognize the dedicated people who give support to their loved ones. And Rachel Weinstein is a grief specialist, educator, and founder of the Jacksonville Center for Grief and Loss. But Rachel, in addition to your full-time job and your grief counseling and what you do, you've also had to be a caregiver recently, which is why I found kind of combining the topics with you a little relevant. But, I think what a lot of people don't realize with caregivers is, in a way, we all become a caregiver at some point.
There's no question.
We care for, parents care for their children growing up.
Right.
And then in turn, we might end up caring for our parents on the other end. When we hit that midlife age, our kids, if we have kids, have grown and maybe moved on to have families of their own.
Right.
But with baby boomers, especially the largest population in America, we are going to have a lot of caring to do going forward. Right. So give us a little history about how you became a caregiver almost recently, and you don't have to go into full details, just whatever you're comfortable with sharing.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I have been educating about grief and the stress that caregivers undergo for a long time, and I've had some experience with it when my dad was ill years ago with dementia, but I wasn't full-time. I wasn't there. I was in another part of the state. So I would visit him, but it wasn't the same as being a hands-on caregiver. Now, here I am, fast forward to, 2021, and my mom suddenly has a stroke, and I have two siblings, and I'm the youngest of three. The oldest sibling is on the other, he's in New York City, right? So here I am in Jacksonville. My sisters, we're both in the same area. She got to my mom first, she and her husband. But the second part of what, in terms of what my mom needed and what we needed to do was to negotiate who could do what. So my sister was able to be there before I could, and then we did kind of this switch whereby then my sister had some other obligations, so I came in and I visited, and my mom had to go back to the hospital, and I was the best one to help negotiate things in the hospital. So I did that piece, and then it came to arranging for my mom's care after the hospital. And again, I've been in the healthcare field for a long time, so I took that piece on. And as well, I was the only one who single and able to stay with my mom overnight. So my sister was as involved as she could be, but I was physically there 24/7. And it became real to me just how exhausting, emotional, and stressful that role is, because I was trying to juggle caring for my animal, having my full-time work, which is separate from, I actually do two things. I do my grief support, but I also work in healthcare. And so having to manage both of those things, I had to call off work, and I didn't really have paid time off to take. All of those things combined were very stressful for me. On top of that, seeing my mom in a vulnerable position, not as able to do what she had before. And it was really tough. It was just really, really tough.
Yeah, that's everything I've ever heard. Some interesting statistics you touched on. Over half of family caregivers are women. And most caregivers work outside of the home, either part or full-time, in addition to their caregiving duties. So it is scary that to be a caregiver, you do have to take off time from work if you don't have PTO or or vacation days or whatever it may be,
Right.
you have a loss of income, which puts added stress onto you as well. And so I think what happens along the way, and we're going to touch on this a little bit in the next segment with the nurse practitioner, is your health diminishes as well as the person you're caring for. So we'll touch on that a little bit coming up. But for you, you also mentioned something too. Seeing your mom in a vulnerable position. We're not used to seeing that with our parents.
Right. It was scary.
How do you handle that?
You know, I'm not immune. Everything I talk about in grief work, it's not that my intellect can just help me bypass the real human impact of that. It was tough. I was sinking for a while. I needed to reach out to my own support system and give an SOS to some of my friends and just ask for what I needed. I took my own advice and I reached out and just said, look, I'm struggling. I need to vent, or, you know, I need some TLC. I had to start drawing boundaries eventually and say, I need you to step in. My brother ended up coming, not because I asked him to, but I was speaking with my sister, and then she was speaking with him and saying, I think it'd be great if you could come and visit. So he came. By the time he got there, he was able to help my mom, but in different ways. It was interesting. Each of us offered something very different. We all have different skill sets. So my brother helped to set up her Kindle and, you know, doing things like that for her that she found very helpful. I was helping in another way, more of a negotiating through the health care system and making her appointments and taking notes when I was in appointments with her and guiding that whole process. And my sister in much the same way. I mean, we were all terrific in our own ways. I think we all did the best that we could, but I know that we were all stressed.
Did you ever feel a loss during that time?
Sure. I started realizing that my mom could not be my mom in just the same way she had even a day before, where I would tell her something and she would get really easily confused, and I had the same expectations of her. Well, I just told you that, you know. Now I wouldn't say that to her, but I just thought, I don't understand what just. And then I would realize, oh, this is a result of the stroke. This is really different, or this was if not the stroke, just the stress of her experience in the hospital. It's very common for people, especially elders, coming out of the hospital. I had my own boyfriend, who's a physician, had to remind me that elders don't bounce back as quickly. So he said it's probably less the stroke and more the fact that she just had a pretty stressful event and she doesn't rebound as quickly. So she was easily overwhelmed.
I can only imagine.
And seeing her that way made me feel overwhelmed.
Of course.
I hid it, you know, and I didn't really have a place or the luxury of time to vent. I held it for quite a while until I noticed that I was physically starting to fail. And then I was like, I need to take my own advice and start drawing a boundary, calling in the troops to take over for me, saying, no, I think my mom can do X, Y, or Z, even though she's a little worried. I think she's perfectly safe to do this. I had set up help for her. So I had to step back and remind myself of what my own limitations were.
And how's your mom doing now?
Great. Thankfully.
Good.
Not exactly the same as before. She's got some residual issues with some of her, not mobility, but more like, vision.
So do you feel more prepared for what could happen down the line if, should her health continue to deteriorate? Should she have another stroke?
Yeah. Are you
in a better place, do you feel, to support her?
It's a great question. It did spark a conversation between myself and my mom, myself and my sister, about, this is only going to, as the years go on, this is only going to become exaggerated. So it's not like we're going the other direction. We're still, years are passing and she's 84. So we had to have some conversation. We still have to have them. We're not there yet. No, it's just started.
Tough
It's a tough conversation to have.
Yeah. Rachel Weinstein is the grief specialist and educator, founder of Jacksonville Center for Grief and Loss. We're talking a lot about grief and loss, and we're also talking a lot about being a caregiver to her mom. And coming up in the next segment, we're going to continue the conversation about caregivers and your primary care provider. We are going to have a Millennium Physician Group nurse practitioner join our conversation. We're going to talk about why caregivers need to care for themselves. You touched on it a little bit while caring for their loved ones. So you'll definitely want to stick around for the next segment. Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inspiration Health Radio, sponsored by Millennium Physician Group. I'm Michelle McCormick. Each week, we talk about the healthcare issues that are important to you, inviting providers and experts to inspire you to take control of your healthcare decisions. We have had a great conversation today about grief and loss around the holiday times as we move into November and December. But also, November is National Family Caregivers Month. Didn't know it was much of a thing, but it's a super important one. The purpose of this is to recognize the dedicated people who give support to their loved ones. And the numbers are growing, like we just spoke with Rachel in the last segment. Joining us now is Brandi Epperson. Brandi is a nurse practitioner at the Millennium Physician Group office at 1555 Kingsley Avenue in Orange Park. And also Rachel Weinstein is still with us. She's a grief counselor and caretaker as well. And Rachel is an educator from the Jacksonville Center for Grief and Loss. So welcome, Brandi, to the show. Really appreciate you. You're a nurse practitioner at our Orange Park location. Give us a little background about yourself and what brought you on your journey to this area.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. So I'm Brandi Epperson. I'm a family nurse practitioner. I recently retired from the Navy. I served for 28 years, right out of high school. And after completing my last tour overseas in Guam, I decided it was the right time to make the jump and transition into civilian practice. So I have been so fortunate to land at Millennium Physician Group, where I just find it is amazing opportunity and such good people to work with. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, we are super excited to have you at our new Kingsley Avenue location in Orange Park. And with your naval background, it's fitting for our city with its Navy personnel and naval people that live here and work here. We've been talking about Caregiving Month and grief associated too, but I really wanted to talk with you, Brandi, about how in this National Family Caregivers Month, how often do you see a caregiver accompany a patient to their primary care appointment?
Quite often, actually. And I'm always so happy when they do, because the things that we talk about, particularly as you age and the population becomes more complex medically, they can be hard to understand. They can be hard to remember. Sometimes you don't have all the questions yourself, and your caregiver or your spouse or your adult child will be with you, and they'll remember the things that were really important to you and the things that were important to them. And they'll ask the right questions, and they'll really, the patient benefits, the family member benefits. And as a healthcare provider, it's very rewarding for me to interact with the family and know kind of a little bit better idea of that dynamic that's going on at home. And it really helps give us a better picture. So I'm really glad when they come and we see all different types of caregivers, spouses, children, sometimes roommates or just good friends are caregivers.
Right. Rachel was talking about how she was the note taker. Mm-hmm. You want to give Brandi?
Yeah, Brandi, I was just saying earlier that when I went to my mom's follow-up appointments after her stroke, I got very accustomed to being the note taker. And one thing that I'm curious from your perspective, are there things that you would suggest caregivers do and not do when they're with their loved one who's the patient, the loved one's the patient, the caregiver's in the room?
Sure, absolutely. The things that I would definitely recommend that you do, one is that you come prepared with a list of questions and concerns. And that way we can really prioritize our time wisely, because we only get so long to go over all of the things that we need to talk about. So, having a list of questions, the things that you've talked about beforehand that you don't want to forget to ask or you don't want to forget to bring up, that is invaluable. Having an opportunity to express your concerns, invaluable. The things I would say don't do is don't always rush to answer the questions for your loved one, because during the interaction, we're often evaluating their responses and how they give them as to their emotional state or their physical state. And so sometimes the caregiver, in their attempt to speed things along or be helpful, they will overtalk their loved one. And that really maybe shadows the picture a little bit with the information we're trying to find out. But there's a time and a place to give the information. And usually if we can't elicit what we need from them, we'll turn and ask the caregiver to give their input too. So being patient with that process.
I think that is spectacular advice
really
right
good.
there. A lot of people try to answer questions. I know as a parent with my 20-year-old kid, I tried to answer all the questions. And I'm like, wait, she needs to speak for herself.
And I often didn't know what to do when I would hear my mom report something, whether it was after the hospital visit or in the hospital, that wasn't correct. And I thought, oh, she's saying that she didn't fall, but she fell, so I didn't want to correct my mother in front of my mother, but I also needed the practitioner to have the right information. So that was a dilemma.
Yeah. So, I mean, Brandi, how did that work in your, in the exam room? How does it's like the caregiver knew she fell, but the patient doesn't remember.
I think usually it depends on just the dynamic between the family member and the patient. Sometimes they just don't remember what they don't remember. And so if it was you and you said, oh, you know what, actually my mom did fall 2 weeks ago. And then mom would say, oh yeah, that's right. Or they wouldn't contradict because they don't remember. But if there really is a good conflict of information, it's sometimes helpful to just hash that out. And that can also identify some deficits in memory and cognition and functioning that we wouldn't know people come off sometimes as very functioning, high functioning.
Right.
And maybe there are some issues.
Yeah. Brandi Epperson is a nurse practitioner at the Millennium Physician Group office at 1555 Kingsley Avenue in Orange Park. And Rachel Weinstein is a grief counselor, and she's also a caretaker. So we're having a great conversation. Now, Brandi, is there ever a time you've noticed that perhaps the caregiver isn't taking care of themselves while you have the patient in the office with you, but maybe it's the caregiver who actually needs a little attention?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes you can tell by body language that maybe there's some stress and maybe there's some strain, but sometimes you just have to ask, how is everything going? How is it going for you? And hopefully your practitioner will ask you that as a caregiver. Just knowing the high rate of stress and compassion fatigue that caregivers are prone to, and that just goes with the territory, we really need to take time to ask the person that's doing the caring, how are you holding up? Do you have the support you need? Do you know about the resources that are available to you? And then stop and listen and give them a chance to answer those questions.
The statistic is 70% of caregivers don't see a doctor for their own health. And, even just taking a nap in the middle of the day can be a refreshing and recharging. Is there any advice you give a caretaker who might be exhibiting that super overwhelmed feeling or maybe even a little bit of depression?
Oh, absolutely. One is to see your PCM. Don't neglect your own health and make sure you're touching base, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And people sometimes, once they've normalized that and they realize, oh, that's right, I still have needs and feelings, and I'm not going to be able to do this thing that I love for my loved one if I'm not healthy and well emotionally and physically. And so there's all kinds of advice that we can give them. One is just to not neglect yourself, spend time with your friends, make self-care a priority. There are support groups that you need to be aware of and consider joining. And then be just aware of the changes in your level of compassion and the way your energy is either draining or being rejuvenated. If you're not aware of those things for yourself, then it's very hard for you to care for somebody else.
Agreed. And Rachel, is there any advice that you would give that overwhelmed caregiver?
Yeah, I think that overwhelm, just to be able to normalize it, to say that it's really normal to feel overwhelmed. And I love what Brandi said about that you can't pour from an empty cup. I would encourage anybody listening who's a caregiver, and that can mean directly caregiving or simply being the one to be your emergency contact and you're checking in quite often on your loved one. It doesn't have to mean 24/7 around the clock care. I think connecting that person with resources is really important. And I know that I was just about to look for the website of the Caregiver Coalition of Northeast Florida. They're a wonderful resource for caregivers.
Right. And Elder Source as well.
Elder Source as well.
Yep. So it's out there. Well, Brandi Epperson from the 1555 Kingsley Avenue, nurse practitioner with Millennium Physician Group. I thank you so much for your time today and your insight and your expertise. Thank you for your service. And the Orange Park office, if you'd like to get in touch with Brandi for any of your healthcare needs, is 904-541-0670. So Brandi, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And Rachel, why don't you give us your information one more time for the listeners so we know how to get in touch with you for any grief, loss, counseling that we seek?
Sure. My website is Jack's Grief. It's JAXGRIEF.com. And my phone number is area code 408-540-4950.
All right. Well, I thank you very much for joining me today. The conversation will continue next time on Inspiration Health Radio. Your healthcare journey, very important to us, and our goal at Millennium Physician Group is to work together to achieve the best health outcome for you, and that starts with seeing your primary care provider, like Brandi. See our website for a full list of offices and providers at millenniumphysician.com. In good health, I'm Michelle McCormick. Have a great day.